The morning sun streamed through the high windows of the Naval Base Auditorium, falling across rows of young sailors and SEAL candidates who sat in restless anticipation. They had been summoned here for what the daily briefing called a mandatory physical training orientation. But the rumor mill had been buzzing for days with a different name. Colonel Thomas Reed was in the building. For the men and women in uniform who filled the wooden seats, adjusting their covers and straightening their blouses, the name alone carried weight. Some had trained under his curriculum. Others had only heard the stories passed down like folklore. The colonel who could run 20 miles before breakfast, who had written the book on combat endurance, who had never once in his 22-year career missed a single day of physical training. The murmuring died down slowly as a stocky command master chief took the stage, adjusting the microphone with the easy familiarity of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. But instead of launching into the usual announcements about proper form and safety regulations, he simply said, "Ladies and gentlemen, give your attention to the front." The side door opened, and the room rose as one to attention, the sharp sound of hundreds of shoes scuffing against the floor echoing off the walls. Colonel Reed walked to the center of the stage with the unmistakable gait of a man who had spent decades pushing his body to its absolute limits. He was tall and lean, with the kind of build that suggested not just strength but economy of movement. Nothing wasted, nothing excessive. His uniform was crisp, his posture immaculate, and his face carried the weathered look of someone who had spent countless hours under harsh sun and in brutal conditions. He motioned for the audience to sit, and the room settled into an expectant hush. For a long moment, he simply stood there, looking out over the sea of young faces. He saw himself in them, the eagerness, the barely contained energy, the desperate desire to prove themselves worthy of the trident. He had been there once, sitting in those very same seats, listening to some old veteran talk about things that seemed impossible. Now he was that old veteran, carrying stories he never thought he would have to tell. He began to speak, his voice carrying easily to the back of the room without the need for amplification. "I'm going to talk to you today about physical training," he said, and a few people in the audience shifted, or expecting the usual lecture on nutrition and run times and proper stretching techniques. "But not the way you think. I'm not here to tell you how many push-ups you should be able to do or what your mile pace ought to be. I'm here to tell you about the moment I learned what physical training actually means, and I'm here to tell you about the excuses I carried with me for years, the excuses I see so many of you carrying right now." He paused, letting the words sink in. Excuses are heavy. They weigh more than any weight you'll ever lift in the gym. And until you learn to put them down, you will never know what you're actually capable of. The colonel stepped away from the podium, moving to the edge of the stage where he could look directly at the young men and women in the front rows. He talked about his early days in the teams, like about the arrogance of youth and the mistaken belief that he was invincible. He described the training pipeline in vivid detail, the cold water, the sleepless nights, the constant gnawing hunger, the instructors who seemed to take pleasure in pushing candidates past every reasonable limit. But he also talked about something else, something that made several of the senior enlisted personnel in the room nod slowly with recognition. He talked about the stories we tell ourselves. "Every one of you has a voice in your head," he said, tapping his temple with 2 fingers, "and that voice is lying to you. It tells you that you're too tired to go on. It tells you that you've done enough, that nobody would blame you for taking a break, that you can make up the difference tomorrow. That voice is the enemy. It is the most dangerous adversary you will ever face, because it knows all your weaknesses. It knows exactly which buttons to push." He described his own internal voice, the one that had whispered to him for years that he had nothing left to prove. He was a colonel, after all, a Navy SEAL. He had served in multiple combat zones, led men in situations that most people could not imagine. Surely he had earned the right to ease up, to let the young guys carry the load. Surely he had done enough. And the worst part? he asked the silent room. The worst part is that I believed it. I believed it so completely that I started to build my whole life around it. I still showed up. I still went through the motions, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. And the men under my command could tell. They could always tell. The lecture continued, weaving between practical advice and philosophical reflection. Colonel Reed spoke about the physiology of endurance, about the moment when the body screams, "Stop," and the mind has to decide whether to listen. He described the difference between pain and injury, between discomfort and danger, and how the modern world had softened people to the point where they could no longer tell the difference. A few of the younger candidates shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing themselves in his words. He talked about nutrition and sleep and recovery, but always circling back to the same central theme: the excuses we manufacture to protect ourselves from the truth of our own limitations. "You will never know what you're capable of," he said, "as long as you keep giving yourself permission to quit. And that's what excuses are, permission slips. They let you off the hook. They let you walk away with your dignity intact, telling yourself that you could have done it if you really wanted to, but you just didn't want to. That's a lie. The truth is you didn't do it because you chose not to. And until you can face that truth, you will never grow." The room was completely silent now, the kind of silence that happens when a large group of people are all thinking the same thing at the same time. They were thinking about their own excuses, their own permission slips, their own carefully constructed stories about why they couldn't possibly push harder. And then, in the middle of a sentence about the psychology of self-deception, Colonel Reed stopped. He stopped mid-word, his mouth still open, his eyes fixed on something in the middle of the audience. For a moment, nobody moved. And then he raised one hand, pointing directly at a figure in the fifth row. "You," he said, his voice different now, softer, almost wondering. "Stand up." Every head in the auditorium turned to follow his gaze. A woman rose slowly from her seat, her movements careful and deliberate. She was wearing the standard physical training uniform, her dark hair pulled back tightly, her face young but marked by something that made her look older than her years. She stood at attention, facing the stage, her expression unreadable. The colonel walked to the edge of the stage and jumped down, landing lightly on the floor. He walked through the aisle, past rows of seated sailors who barely dared to breathe, until he stood directly in front of her. For a long moment, he just looked at her. Then, in a voice that carried through the silent room, he said, I know you." The woman nodded once, a small movement. "Yes, sir," she said. "I know." The colonel reached out and took her right hand, turning it over gently. He pushed up the sleeve of her uniform jacket, revealing a landscape of scar tissue that ran from her wrist to somewhere above her elbow. Raised, puckered, discolored. The kind of scars that came from shrapnel. The kind of scars that told stories no one wanted to hear. The room seemed to collectively hold its breath as the colonel traced one finger lightly along the edge of the largest scar, his face a mixture of wonder and something that looked almost like grief. The woman's name was Lieutenant Sarah Jenkins, and the colonel had not seen her in nearly 3 years. He remembered the day she had been evacuated from the forward operating base. Al remembers standing on the helicopter pad watching the medevac bird lift off with her inside, remembers thinking that there was no way anyone could survive injuries like that. The IED had detonated directly beneath her Humvee, turning several tons of armored steel into a deadly hailstorm of shrapnel. 3 men had died instantly. 2 more were evacuated with her. The medics on scene had done triage and determined that her wounds were so severe that she should be made comfortable, while they focused on the others. She had overheard them, and she had refused to die. "I wrote you off," the colonel said quietly, still holding her arm, still staring at the scars. "I stood on that pad and watched them load you up, and I wrote you off. I told myself there was no way. I made excuses for why I couldn't do anything more. I had a war to run. After all, I had other men to lead. I couldn't afford to dwell on the ones I lost. His voice cracked slightly, and several people in the audience looked away, uncomfortable with the raw emotion on display. Lieutenant Jenkins shook her head slowly. You didn't write me off, sir. You wrote yourself a permission slip, just like you've been talking about all morning. The colonel looked up at her, his eyes bright. How? He asked. How did you survive? She pulled her arm back gently, rolling her sleeve down over the scars. One step at a time, she said. One breath at a time. The same way you taught us. You gave that lecture 3 years ago, before we deployed. I remembered it when I was lying in that wreckage, bleeding out. I remembered what you said about the voice in your head lying to you. My voice was telling me to just close my eyes and go to sleep. And I told it to shut up. The auditorium had transformed. What had been a routine training lecture had become something else entirely, a living tableau of sacrifice and survival, of the weight that words could carry. Colonel Reed stood before Lieutenant Jenkins, and for the first time in years, he had no words. The carefully constructed lecture, the anecdotes and aphorisms, the wisdom of decades, all of it fell away in the presence of this woman who had refused to die, who had carried his words with her into the valley of the shadow and used them as a weapon. She looked at him with an expression that held no anger, no accusation, only a kind of quiet understanding. You asked how I survived, she said. I survived because I had something to prove, not to you, and not to the Navy, to myself. I needed to know if I was really the person I thought I was, or if I was just pretending. She turned slightly, addressing the room full of silent sailors. The colonel talked about excuses. He's right about them. But he left something out. She paused, gathering her thoughts. The hardest excuses to beat aren't the ones you make for quitting. They're the ones you make for surviving. The voice that tells you that you don't deserve to be here, that other people died and you lived, that your survival was some kind of cosmic mistake. That voice is the loudest one of all, and it will destroy you just as surely as any bullet. Colonel Reed listened, and as he listened, something shifted in his posture. The straight-backed military bearing softened almost imperceptibly, and the young sailors in the room saw something they had never expected to see. A 4-star colonel, a man who had commanded thousands, being taught by a lieutenant with scars on her arm. She was not finished. She told the room about the months in the hospital, the multiple surgeries, the moment when the doctors told her she would never regain full use of her right arm. She told them about the physical therapy sessions that left her weeping with frustration, about the nights when she lay awake wondering if death would have been easier. She told them about the other wounded warriors she had met, the ones who had given up, and the ones who had not. And she told them about the moment when she finally understood what the colonel had been trying to say in all those years of lectures. Physical training isn't about your body, she said, or it's about your mind. It's about teaching yourself that you can endure things you never thought you could endure. It's about proving to yourself over and over again that you are stronger than your fears. The scars on my arm remind me of that every single day. They remind me that I survived something that should have killed me. And if I can survive that, I can survive anything, including my own excuses. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the senior officers in the back rows, men who had spent decades learning to control their emotions, found themselves struggling to maintain their composure. Colonel Reed stood motionless, his eyes fixed on Lieutenant Jenkins. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but in the stillness, everyone heard him. I owe you an apology, he said. Oh, I spent years telling myself that I had done enough, that I had earned the right to coast. I was so busy making excuses for myself that I forgot what it felt like to truly fight. And then you stand there, with wounds that would have killed most people, and you remind me what courage actually looks like." Lieutenant Jenkins shook her head. "You don't owe me anything, sir. You gave me the words I needed when I needed them most. You just forgot to take your own advice." A sound escaped the colonel, something between a laugh and a sob. "I did," he admitted. "I absolutely did." He turned to face the audience, spreading his arms wide. "You see? This is what I've been trying to tell you all morning. The excuses never stop. They never go away. You have to keep fighting them every single day for your entire life. The moment you think you've won, that's the moment you've lost." He walked back toward the stage, but instead of climbing up, he turned and leaned against it, facing the room like an old friend sharing stories around a campfire. He talked about the guilt he had carried after that deployment, the men he had lost, the letters he had written to families. He talked about the nightmares that still woke him in the dark hours before dawn, the faces that haunted his dreams. He talked about the weight of command and how it never really left you, even after you took off the uniform. And he talked about Lieutenant Jenkins, about watching her lift off on that medevac, about writing her off in his own mind because it was easier than hoping. "I made an excuse," he said simply. "I told myself that she was gone, that there was nothing I could do, that I had to focus on the living, and I believed it. I believed it so completely that when I saw her standing there today, I almost didn't recognize her, because in my mind, she was already dead." He looked at her, standing in the aisle where he had left her. "But she wasn't dead. She was fighting. She was fighting while I was making excuses, and that's the difference between a survivor and someone who just exists." Lieutenant Jenkins walked forward, joining him at the front of the room. Together they stood before the assembled sailors, two warriors from different generations, bound by a shared history of pain and perseverance. She held out her scarred arm for everyone to see, turning it slowly so that the light caught the twisted tissue. "This is what survival looks like," she said. "It's not pretty. It's not heroic. It's just one day after another, putting one foot in front of the other, refusing to quit even when everything inside you wants to give up. The colonel taught me that, even if he forgot it for a while, and now I'm teaching it to you." She scanned the faces in the audience, making eye contact with as many as she could. "Some of you will go to war. Some of you will come home changed. Some of you will carry scars that no one can see. And some of you will be tempted to make excuses, to tell yourselves that you've done enough, that you've earned the right to rest, that nobody would blame you for slowing down. Don't listen to that voice. It's lying. You haven't done enough. None of us have. There's always more to give, more to fight for, more to become." The lecture continued for another hour, but it was no longer a lecture in any traditional sense. It was a conversation, a shared exploration of what it meant to be human in a profession that demanded superhuman sacrifice. Colonel Reed and Lieutenant Jenkins traded stories, each one building on the last, creating a tapestry of experience that held the room spellbound. He spoke of his own mentors, the old SEALs who had shaped him, the lessons they had passed down. She spoke of her recovery, the long road back from the edge of death, the small victories that no one else would ever know about. Together, they painted a picture of military service that was neither romanticized nor demonized, just real, in all its complexity and cost. And through it all, the theme remained constant. The battle against excuses, against the voice that whispered surrender, against the temptation to settle for less than everything you had to give. As the session drew to a close, Colonel Reed asked everyone in the room to stand. They rose as one, hundreds of sailors in perfect unison, their faces reflecting the emotional journey they had just shared. He walked among them, moving slowly down the aisles, looking each one in the eye as he passed. "Look at the person next to you," he commanded. "Really look at them. See them. Because one day, that person might be the reason you keep fighting. One day, that person might say something that saves your life. One day, that person might stand in front of you, covered in scars, and remind you what you're capable of. He reached the back of the room and turned to face forward, his voice carrying effortlessly through the space. Lieutenant Jenkins saved my life today. She didn't know she was going to do it. She just showed up, like she always does, and told the truth. That's all any of us can do. Show up. Tell the truth. Keep fighting. The excuses will always be there, waiting for you. But so will the people who need you. So will the mission. So will the person you could become if you just refuse to quit. The room held its silence for a long moment after he stopped speaking. Then, slowly at first, but building into a wave, the applause began. It was not the polite, obligatory applause of a briefing room. It was something deeper: recognition, gratitude, the acknowledgement of a truth that everyone in that room needed to hear. Lieutenant Jenkins stood at the front, her scarred arm at her side, her face calm. Colonel Reed walked back to join her. And together they faced the room full of sailors who would carry this moment with them for the rest of their careers. The Command Master Chief returned to the stage, his own eyes suspiciously bright, and dismissed the formation with a simple order. Go forth and prove yourselves worthy of the people standing next to you. As the sailors filed out, many stopped to shake hands with the colonel and the lieutenant, to thank them, to share quick stories of their own struggles. And when the last one had gone, Colonel Reed turned to Lieutenant Jenkins and said quietly, "I think I'm going to start running again. Really running. Not the old man jog I've been doing." She smiled. "I'll pace you, sir, but I warn you, I don't go slow." He laughed, a real laugh, the kind he had not heard from himself in years. "I wouldn't expect anything less." In the weeks and months that followed, the story of that morning spread through the naval community like wildfire. It was told and retold in briefing rooms and barracks, on ships at sea, and in bases on land. It became a kind of legend. The day a colonel learned from a lieutenant. The day scars silenced excuses. The day a room full of warriors remembered why they fought. And every time it was told, the message remained the same. The excuses we carry are heavier than any weight we will ever lift, and the only way to put them down is to face the truth about who we are and who we could become. For the young sailors who had been there, the memory of that morning would surface at unexpected moments, during difficult training evolutions, during long deployments, during the dark nights when the voice of doubt grew loud. And they would remember a scarred arm raised in the light, and a colonel admitting his own failures, and the silence that fell when pretense gave way to truth. They would remember that courage was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear have the final word. And they would keep fighting, one day at a time, refusing to let their own excuses win.